Hey guys, this is Dave with Gizaudio, and this is the Matrix Audio Element M2 streamer. It was released in 2022, I believe, so it's been out for a couple of years now. And of course, that means in terms of its internal components and general features, the processing, while it is what I would consider to be fairly feature rich and generally of high quality, it's still kind of an older device. So I guess my goals in this review process were kind of multifaceted. Of course, my primary goal was to simply try and determine just how good it sounded, but I also wanted to see how versatile it could be as far as using it both as a desktop device for my full-size headphones and IEMs, but then also integrating it in with my home audio system in my main living room to kind of try and figure out where I think it might fit best for my usage. So as usual, we'll go over what's included in the box. We'll talk about the specifications and features, and then I'll share my sound impressions of the Element M2. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. So basically everything you see here out on the desk is what's included in the box. And the M2 is priced at $3,100, which officially makes this the most expensive device I've ever reviewed on this channel. Now, as for the design and build, the design is pretty consistent with the other devices in the Element lineup. I do like the matte silver and black combination. It just looks really nice, it looks clean, and it goes quite well with most of my other components. The build quality is also very good. It has a very solid structure. The volume knob also feels really nice. None of the plugs feel loose. Everything feels nice and tight. And one of the first things I noticed was just how heavy this thing was. I mean, this thing has got some serious weight to it, and that goes for the remote as well. It also feels quite robust, and while it's not necessarily heavy, it does have some weight to it, which I do like. Everything about both the M2 itself and the remote just feels very solid and premium. As for the Element M2's specifications and features, in the front we have a power button. We then have the power indicator light, a 6.35 single-ended and 4.4 balanced headphone output. We then have a small color touch screen along with some touch play, pause, playlist, and skip buttons. Right next to that is the multifunction volume wheel. That, when pressed, also functions as a mute button. On the back, we have a pair of RCA and a pair of XLR analog outputs. We then have coaxial, optical, I2S, ARC, and USB digital inputs. They've also included a Type-C port that allows you to connect an external hard drive. And then we have a 1 gigabit capable Ethernet port, a trigger in and out, and then right above that is the Wi-Fi antenna. So we've got lots of connection options. On the inside, we have an ES9028 Pro DAC, which can decode up to 32-bit PCM, and DSD512. It also features a Crystech CCHD 950 femtosecond clock. Now, as far as power output, the 6.35 single-ended headphone output will give you 2 volts RMS and 1.2 watts of power, while the 4.4 output will give you 4 volts RMS and 1.8 watts of power output. Now, jumping over to the software side, you can access the settings either by scrolling to the left using the touch display on the front of the device, or by using the MA remote app, both of which will give you access to all of your basic settings things like input and output selection, sound filters, and the display settings. However, the MA Remote app takes that level of control up a notch, and it also allows you to access your phone's onboard music files or choose from multiple streaming platforms like Roon, Qobuz, Spotify, or Tidal. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the sound. So as I had mentioned in my opening, I wanted to try the Element M2 in a couple of different listening scenarios, using it as a desktop device and here in my office/studio where I keep most of my headphones and IEMs, but I also wanted to try it in my living room with my home audio system because I was already using the Matrix Mini i4 for streaming in here, and I didn't really need a second streamer for this room. And it worked great with both scenarios, but in the end, I think I found it most useful with it integrated in with my home audio system because it was just super easy to connect to my Wi-Fi, and then that gave me streaming capabilities with my main living room audio system, and then I could also use it with my TV as well using the ARC HDMI. So in terms of versatility, because of the amount of inputs and outputs available with the M2, I found myself being quite pleased with all of the different usage options. But what about sound? Well, let's go ahead and talk about drivability first. And since of course Audio is mostly geared towards focusing on IEMs and headphones, that's what I'm going to center the bulk of the review around. And then I might briefly discuss how it sounded with my home audio system. So as I had mentioned before, the power output of the 4.4 balanced output is pretty decent at 1.8 watts, and that is enough to power most headphones. And even with a 300 ohm headphone, it's going to give you about 1 watt, which is still good, but honestly not great. And here's the thing, my two desktop references right now are the FIO K19, which cost $1,350, and then the Aoun S17 Pro, which costs $699. And while, of course, neither of those have streaming capabilities, they are both very powerful and they both sound excellent. The K19 gives me an impressive 8 watts of power out of the balanced output, and then the S17 Pro gives me about 7.5 watts out of its balanced output. And again, neither of those devices have streaming capabilities, but that's why I just paired it with the Matrix Mini i4 streaming DAC, which costs about $650. So I have tons of power, I have streaming capabilities, and the quality is what I would consider pretty much to be at reference levels for a lot less money. All that to say this, while the Element M2 does have sufficient power output for headphones at this price, I would have liked to see a little more power output, and I'm not quite sure I would consider it to be a good value strictly in terms of power output. But the bigger issue for me was that while I do feel like it gave me excellent sound performance from the headphone outputs, I can't say that I really noticed any significant improvement in sound performance over either my S17 Pro or my FIO K19, or really any other high-end headphone DAC amp I've heard or owned, at least up to this point. As a matter of fact, I actually felt like the S17 Pro sounded just a little more natural, and it also gave me slightly better dynamics with my higher end headphones, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. So when I first sat down with the Element M2 and started cycling through all of my test tracks and swapping out different headphones and IEMs, my initial impressions were really good, and I truly felt like I was listening to a higher end device. And all of the markers that I looked for seemed to be present. It had excellent detail, it was resolving, it was transparent, it had good dynamics, it was quiet, and generally just seemed to deliver consistently good sound at almost any volume level. So it was just as detailed, dynamic, and transparent at high volumes as it was medium or low volumes. And that performance level was consistent throughout my entire testing process. Even the spatial attributes like staging, layering, positional cues, everything just seemed to be almost on point. And even when I was going through my comparison phase, I have to say I was really impressed with the M2's performance, because again, nearly all of the attributes, all of those markers that I look for in a reference level device were there. However, I do wish it had a little more power output, and I also did feel like it leaned ever so slightly clinical, and it actually reminded me a little bit of the FiiO K19 in that regard, because it had just a little bit of an edge or some brightness to it, again, similar to the K19. However, I do feel like the M2 was maybe just a tad smoother, and I felt like it was able to tame that edge just a little better than the K19. And then the S17 Pro, of course, leans slightly the other direction, so it's a little more rich, a little more lush sounding, and the M2 lands somewhere right in between the two, so not quite as clinical as the K19, but not as rich or musical as the S17 Pro. So it did still fall within the range of neutral, but it leaned just a little bright to my ears. And I know this is more of a preference thing, but for me at this price point, that's not something I would typically want to hear. Now, something else I noticed was that while I didn't necessarily feel like the bass presentation on the whole was thin when compared to the S17 Pro, I did prefer the slightly weightier presentation of the S17 Pro over the M2. And there were moments with certain tracks that I felt like the M2 could have used just a little more weight and maybe a little more authority in its low end. And that was another attribute that kind of reminded me of the K19. But again, detail levels, transparency, all the spatial and staging attributes were otherwise excellent. So as far as its performance with headphones and as a desktop unit, it's very versatile. And while I do feel like the M2 gets almost everything right and really does offer a higher end listening experience, its presentation was just a tad too bright and edgy for my preference. But no doubt there will be those who will absolutely fall in love with it. So that's my experience using it as a desktop device with headphones and IMs. But what about with my home audio system? And again, this is going to be brief because I've already gone a little too long. So as I had stated earlier, my home system is where I felt the M2 fit best, at least for me, because I already have a pretty decent setup for testing headphones and IMs in here in my studio. But I did need a new streamer DAC for my home system, and I have to say, for that application, I could not be happier, because not only is the sound quality on the DAC side of this device excellent, with my particular setup, I have a ton of connection options. So I can use the ARC HDMI port with my TV, plus it has an I2S port. I can connect an external hard drive if I want, and it has the 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi capabilities, which my mini i4 does not have. So that's really nice. But again, more importantly, the DAC section, while maybe still having some of that edge and those brighter attributes, when paired with my amp, my Cambridge amp, it sounds spectacular, and it integrated seamlessly in with my Roon and Qobuz services. And I can either stream high-res audio through those streaming services or from my external hard drives. So again, it offers both excellent sound performance and it's very versatile as well. But here's the thing, at the end of the day, for me, and I'm sure for most of you, it always comes down to the value to performance ratio. And I have to admit, I am struggling with the $3,100 price. And while I do feel like if I'm basing my recommendation strictly on its sound performance, the internal components, and obviously a well thought through engineering and design, versatility, ease of use, and just its overall quality, and while I truly do feel like all of those attributes do add up to what I feel is a high-end device, when I factor the price in, it does make it hard for me to give it a full recommendation because it's just so darn expensive. So the bottom line though is that you have to kind of decide for yourself based on the information that I provided whether or not the Element M2 could potentially be a good fit for you. So that concludes my review of the Matrix Audio Element M2. If you are new to the Gazaudio channel and you like our videos, please take a minute and hit that subscribe button. And if you want to go a step further, you can also support us through our Patreon. I'll be sure and leave a link in the description. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch this review. Please like this video. Please share this video. I hope you have an awesome day.